So it's a little confusing still for many people to understand A, what a function is, B, what a one-to-one function is, and C, what an onto function is. So I like to use the following analogy. The analogy I like to use is almost like defending a medieval castle. Imagine you are the archers, or you are in the domain A, and you have a domain B, which is going to be this field of enemies. In this case, I tried to draw some Vikings. A function would be saying that every one of your archers, the archers here represent your elements in A, every single one of them only targets one enemy. You will not have an archer, the same archer, targeting two enemies. You are not going to have that. They're not going to fire more than one arrow, is what you're basically saying when you are saying that. So a function means each archer is firing at one enemy, not more than one. So what does one-to-one mean in this analogy? Well, one-to-one means if f of a is equal to f of b, or think of those as your arrows. So if this guy here was hit by two arrows, f of a, f of b, and clearly f of a is equal to f of b because they hit the same target. The targets are what our elements in B are. This is one element, two element, three element. If they are equal, they must have originally come from the same archer. The same archer must have shot both of those arrows. If you had, for example, this bottom arrow shot by this other archer, this would be an example of a function that is not one-to-one. Remember, this is still a function because your archers are each still shooting one arrow, but when we're talking about one-to-one and onto, we're looking at where the arrows are actually going to be hitting. So this is what one-to-one would mean. Okay, so what does onto mean in this case? Well, onto means everything in B. Every enemy here in B has an existing X or an existing archer or arrow that hit them. So you're basically saying everything in B got hit. Everything in B has something that connects it back to A. So if we had archers, for example, fire like this, firing at that one, and this one fires at this guy as well, we find this is not onto because this guy was not hit. He has no arrows flying at him or towards him. So this would be an example of not an onto function. However, instead, if we had this third guy over here, there we go. If we had this third guy fire at this guy, then yes, this would in fact be onto because every single element or enemy in B got hit. Okay, so let's quickly look at some variations of functions that are one-to-one, not onto, functions that are onto, not one-to-one, functions that are both, and functions that are neither. So to start off with, let's look at the following organization of attack. If you had every archer in A hit the following pattern, hitting this guy, and hitting this guy, this would be one-to-one. Because notice, all of the arrows hitting this guy come from the same archer. All of the arrows hitting this guy come from the same archer, and so on and so forth. So it is in fact one-to-one. However, is it onto? And the answer is going to be no, because we need every single enemy here to be hit, and this guy was not hit. So this is not onto. If you had the archers fire like this, this would not be one-to-one, because notice all of the arrows hitting this guy are not coming from the same archer. There's one arrow coming from this archer and another arrow coming from a different archer. So this is not one-to-one. But remember, it is still a function because each archer is firing only one arrow. Is this function onto? And the answer is yes. Every single enemy here is in fact being hit. So yes, this is in fact onto. Let's look at the following function. If we have an archer fire at this guy, an archer fire at this guy, and an archer fire at this guy, is the function one-to-one? The answer is no, because all of the arrows hitting this guy are not coming from the same archer. There's one coming from this guy and one coming from that guy. So no, it is not one-to-one. Is the function onto? Well, let's look. Is everyone in B hit? And the answer is no. There is this guy here who is not being hit. Another way of seeing something that's false for both of them is something like this, where instead of this guy firing at a different enemy, if we have all of our archers fire at one person, it's still a function because every archer's firing independently. They're not firing twice or simultaneously. However, this guy's being hit by multiple archers, and we're not hitting all of our enemies. So this is in fact neither one-to-one or onto. The last function we're going to look at with this analogy. If we have this archer firing at this guy, this archer firing at this guy, and this archer firing at this guy. Let me draw this arrow maybe a little bit nicer. We'll draw it like this. Is this function one-to-one? Yes, because every arrow hitting each enemy is coming from one archer. So yes, it is in fact one-to-one. Is the function onto? Well, it looks like we are hitting every single enemy, so yes, it is also onto. So this would be an example of something that is bijective. In math, we can say something is both one-to-one and onto. We have a word for that. It's called bijective. Something else I forgot to mention is the other words we have for one-to-one and onto are the following. So a one-to-one function is sometimes called injective, like that. Something that is onto is sometimes called surjective, like this. When a function is both injective and surjective, it is called bijective. But these are just details. The naming here doesn't matter which you prefer. I prefer one-to-one and onto because that's easier to say and easier to explain to people. But there we go. Hopefully this has you better understand what onto and one-to-one mean in functions. One last note I want to make is, of course, in this case, I had my two functions be finite. I have a certain amount of archers and a certain amount of enemies. However, if I were you, I would be picturing a battlefield where this wall is infinite with hundreds or thousands of archers, and this field of enemies is also infinite. There's massive hordes of enemies. And all you have to think about is, in my function, is every archer hitting one distinct target? Every archer is hitting someone who another person is not hitting, right? You're not going to have Jimmy and Bob aim at the same target. So that would mean you're checking if it is one-to-one. So if this horde of enemies, if every archer you have is aiming at a distinct person to shoot at, it is one-to-one. If you have an onto function, what you should be picturing is that when you have this massive infinite horde of enemies and an infinite wall of archers, you're saying every archer is going to hit an enemy. There are going to be no survivors, is what you're saying when it is onto. When one of those two isn't true, whether it is two archers aiming at one person, which would make it not one-to-one, or firing at everyone leaves a survivor, then it is not onto. That is the other alternative you should look for. So that is a broader way of how you should use this analogy to picture what your function is actually doing or what it means for it to not or be one of these two criterias.